Okay, I want to say a little more about this idea of school teacher using Sweet Home as his laboratory to study slaves. This is another example of Morrison making reference to the pro-slavery argument that we talked about last time. Because slaveholders, well, Southern intellectuals used science as a way of justifying slavery, that they used quote unquote science. It was a good science. Because in the way that scientific research is done is the scientist has a hypothesis, then they conduct an experiment, and they follow the evidence to the conclusion. So they may or may not prove their hypothesis correct with their experiment. But what these scientists did is they had the conclusion first, and then they reverse engineered it to have reasons. So school teacher, he is not studying them to help him reach conclusions. He is studying them to help find evidence to justify the conclusions that he's already reached. And that's the way that this science worked as a part of the pro-slavery argument. So, for instance, some of the science that they used was phrenology. Phrenology is a pseudoscience that is the study of skull shape and size. They would look at the bumps on people's heads and reach conclusions about their health, their mental health, all kinds of things. So they studied, there was a work called Crania Americana, where scientists studied the skulls of people from different racial origins and reached conclusions about intelligence. Okay, so a Caucasian skull suggested a superior intellect, whereas an African or a Native American skull suggested an inferior intellect. There is no science, valid science in that. Another example of the science came from a professor at LSU named Samuel Cartwright, who argued, and this was in the antebellum period, who argued that a slave who ran away suffered from mental illness, essentially, that it was a defective slave who would want to escape. That there was something mentally defective about any slave who wanted to escape. And he diagnosed it as drapetomania, is what it was called, a disease that caused slaves to run away. And he designed treatments for healing that slave of the disease. He said it caused sores and the desire to run away. And a third example of this is there was a scientist who studied the complexion of field slaves and house slaves, and he found that house slaves were lighter complected generally than field slaves. And his theory was that proximity to the white family, the slaveholder, was actually causing the skin to lighten. That being close to whites would make you turn white, basically, which is bad science, because field slaves were working in the sun, and house slaves were often chosen because of their lighter complexion. So this is the way that the science worked. And this is what school teachers are doing. And it's interesting to me that Morrison really does tap into that. She kind of gestures toward that as a way of getting us to think about that, all of that justification and rationale for slavery, because what we see is a plantation that falls apart. Really, Sweet Home goes into crisis because of school teacher, not because of the slaves. That he creates this world that goes wrong. Anyway, okay, so and school teacher, Stampede makes reference to that at the very end of this chapter, and it's a really good quote. I left my book downstairs, but he says, I'm going to paraphrase. Basically, he says, white people believed that under every dark skin there was a jungle, swift, unnavigable waters, screaming baboons, sleeping snakes, screaming baboons, red gums ready for their sweet white blood. But in reality, school teacher Stampede says, it wasn't the jungle. That jungle was not something they brought with them from what he calls the other livable place, which would have been Africa. It was the jungle that white people planted in them. And then that jungle overtook white people as well. This goes back to when I teach African American literature, we read Frederick Douglass. And one of the things Frederick Douglass is saying in his slave narrative is that slavery was an institution with such decay at its core that it harmed and destroyed everyone that it touched. It turned slaveholders into inhumane people who had, the saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. They had absolute power over other people, and it became corrupting, and it bred fear and resentment and hatred and anger, and it was a system that led to such decay that slavery ruined everyone it touched, both slave and master. And that's what Stampede is saying here, that it wasn't the jungle, that the jungle was planted there by white people, and then it infected them too. Okay, so it wasn't Setha's nature to kill her child. It was what school teacher did to her and what he threatened to do to her children, which was see them as animals. Okay. One other thing, just to make reference to it, in case it stuck out to you, is Stampede finds this, because sometimes people ask this question. Stampede finds this ribbon, and he's carrying it in his pocket, and he links that ribbon to this whole description he says of his marrow was tired. And what he finds attached, it's kind of stuck to the bottom of his boat, is a curl, a woolly black curl with a piece of scalp still attached to it, tied with a ribbon. And he takes the ribbon and puts it in his pocket. It's a red ribbon. And he discards the hair. And he links that to, he's just tired. He says at one point, what are these people? You tell me, Jesus, what are they? Because there seems to never be an end to that decay and corruption that slavery has bred. And the implication there, because the curl has a piece of scalp still stuck to it, the implication is that a little girl has been killed and just disposed of, maybe in the river. That's what eats at him when he finds that ribbon. And he says, then he's thinking about the ribbon, and he goes back to Setha's house, and he hears the voices, and he says, those voices are the people of the broken necks, of fire-cooked blood, and of little girls who have lost their ribbons. Okay, so those voices are the voices of the victims of slavery. And so Beloved represents that. If you'll remember, the dedication at the very beginning of the book is to the 60 million and more, the victims of slavery. And so Beloved, and we see this in another chapter I'll talk about in just a second, Beloved is not just the ghost of the daughter. She is also representative of the people of the broken necks, of fire-cooked blood, and of little girls who have lost their ribbons, just the victims of slavery. The way we know this is really articulated very well in chapter 22, which I didn't assign you, but you may want to go read it. It's 4 pages long. It's a chapter without any punctuation. It's very imagistic. It is, meaning you kind of have to visualize what she's saying because it doesn't make a lot of sense unless you start to visualize it. It's the slave ship. And it is the voice of beloved on the slave ship in the middle passage. Somebody said this in the comments, in the discussion board. Why does she talks about being on the other side, why does it look like a slave ship? Very good observation, because then we see it, beloved on a slave ship. And she says in there's no punctuation in that chapter. It's just sort of like a stream of consciousness. It's very disorienting. Morrison is trying to disorient us in the way that the darkness and stifling quality of the slave ship might feel. I mean, I know it's no comparison, but in writing, it's maybe the best that she could do. But beloved is saying, she says, all of it is now. It is always now. There will never be a time when I am not crouching and watching others who are crouching. Okay. The man on my face is dead. His face is not my face. She talks about the men without skin. Those would have been the white men, the sailors on the slave ship. And the man on her face, the man next to her, has died. She's talking about his pointy white teeth, his pearly white points is what she calls them. In some African cultures, filing teeth into points would have been a sign of being a warrior. It's not unlike the other kinds of body modifications that we do, like tattoos and ear piercings and things like that. And so she's kind of gesturing to a warrior who's been reduced to crouching and dying in the hold of a slave ship. And ultimately in that chapter, beloved says, the woman with my face goes into the water. Okay, so the woman with her face would be your mother. That's who has your face, a face similar to yours maybe. And she goes overboard. And beloved says, she left me. Okay, so, that impulse to commit suicide on the slave ship. She says in that chapter, the people around her are trying to die, trying to leave their bodies behind because it's such a horror. And so the woman with her face chooses to go overboard and leave her behind. That taps into a lot of beloved's anguish over being left behind on the other side, being left alone on the other side. So we begin to see that beloved is not a friendly ghost. And when we move into chapter 24, those chapters 20, 21, 22, and 23 are very much about this obsession that they have, each wanting to control the other. Setha desperately trying to explain, beloved wanting to possess Setha, in some ways, like a toddler would want to possess her mother, that jealousy. Anyway, so it's a series of us seeing sort of the obsessiveness and starting to see how things are going to go wrong. Okay. Morrison has said that the only person, in her mind, the only person that had a right to judge Setha's actions was the baby. And Setha is trying so desperately to help beloved understand why she did what she did, but beloved is vengeful. And book 3 begins with 124 was quiet. So we went from spiteful to loud to quiet as they settle into their sort of vengeful warfare between Setha trying to apologize and be understood, and beloved trying to take vengeance against Setha. So, okay.